One of the most interesting things about Douglas's narrative is its brutal honesty and sort of realism before realism was in vogue. The grittiness, the starkness, the graphic nature of his descriptions are all part of a strategy that would have shocked people at the time. Victorian literature and Romantic literature tended to use circumlocution. It tended to use euphemism. It tended to use things to sort of avoid the unpleasantries of life. We know this from the Victorian attitudes towards sexuality. They wouldn't be graphic in terms of discussing sexuality. Well, they didn't like to be graphic in terms of discussing violence either. Those were both considered to be distasteful. They were both considered to be indelicate. It would disturb the sensibilities of the reader to discuss things in graphic detail. But Douglas is going to do that, and the shock effect is quite profound when he discusses, for example, the situation with Henny or the situation with Demby, the struggle with Mr. Covey, and all of these kinds of things. But he's also very human and does not try to put himself in a position of being better than others. He does not try to, for lack of a better word, romanticize slaves. He says slaves are like other people. But he discusses his gradual liberation, and this is not just a liberation in terms of his physical freedom, but his mental liberation, his psychological liberation, when he is having this slow, gradual epiphany by sort of stair steps towards a higher level of enlightenment about this is what I'm experiencing. Imagine for a moment that you're born into a system and you have no earthly idea why you are who you are, why you are treated the way you are. You have no clue why that is. But gradually throughout your young adult life, you begin to see more and more and more and realize I'm part of a system that is totally exploiting me. I'm part of a system that tells me this about myself and I know it not to be true. And the process that he goes through, the intensity that he goes through in saying, I will not be satisfied with not only my place, but I won't be satisfied for the explanation of how I got where I am. I want to know I want to pull back the curtain and see the man behind the screen pulling the levers. And that's what he's talking about here at certain places. We're going to look at a couple of different passages where we're talking about his own elucidation, his own self-enlightenment. And he begins essentially to talk about, for example, education. He says, he was living with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, A-U-L-D. She very kindly commenced to teach me the ABCs. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. At this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, it was unlawful to use his words, quote, a nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Now, if you teach that nigger, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. End quote. This is Douglas quoting directly from Mr. Auld. He says also in that passage, these words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. Now, this understand, here's Douglas. He's a smart kid. He's a really smart little kid. He understands that this is about power and about control. Even as a small child, he understands this. He says, it was a new and special revelation explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. So in other words, he's found the clue that unravels the mystery. Why is it that blacks are enslaved? How is it that the system is perpetuated? Bingo, that's it. They inadvertently have revealed to me as a small child the reason why they have so much power. They have learning, and we don't, and they deprive us of it. And they know that if we ever get it, then the tables will be turned and they'll lose control over this whole system. Now that's a pretty smart little kid. He says at another passage, he says the light broke in upon me by degrees. I went one day to the wharf of Mr. Waters, and seeing two Irishmen unloading a scow of stone, I went unasked and helped them. And they talked to him, the Irishman. "Are you a slave for life?" I told him that I was. The good Irishman seemed to be deeply affected by the statement. He said to the other that it was a pity so fine a little fellow as myself should be a slave for life, and said it was a shame to hold me. They both advised me to run away to the north. So gradually he's becoming more and more aware of the system. It doesn't have to be like this. Not everyone lives like this. Why is it that I'm trapped in this system? Why is it that I'm enslaved this way? It's because I don't have something they have. And that is knowledge, technology, learning, because that's power. He also, though, doesn't romanticize slaves. He's very, very clear here that frequently they're just like everybody else. He says slaves are like other people and imbibe prejudices quite common to others. They think their own better than that of others. Many, under the influence of this prejudice, think their own masters are better than the masters of their slaves. I mean, it seems odd to us that a slave would brag about how high-powered his master is. You wouldn't think most slaves would be even the least bit interested in their masters, and they would think of them all as being cruel. But there's a pecking order among all human beings. Doesn't matter what status you are in life. I mean, even multi-billionaires have a pecking order. Well, he's got a bigger yacht than I do, etc. And among slaves, Douglas says it was a good thing to be the slave of a very powerful, very rich man. You wouldn't want to be the slave of a poor guy. That's kind of low down the ladder. And he says it's vanity. Sure it is. But what he's pointing out is slaves aren't superhuman. They're just ordinary, normal people who've been placed in this particular position. One of the things that he also points out in terms of human foibles is the fact that at holiday celebration times, the masters would allow the slaves to have large quantities of alcohol. They would they'd give them the day off. They would allow them to indulge in all kinds of horrible behavior without any rules whatsoever. And he says at one point that was quite consciously designed. It was designed to essentially teach them that freedom was a bad thing, that you folks don't know how to handle freedom. I mean, look at you. We give you freedom. We give you a couple of days off, and look how you spend it. You spend it getting drunk and getting into fights and tearing stuff up, and then you wake up 2 days later and you're all hungover and you feel terrible and your house is all torn up. See, we're right. You don't know how to govern yourself. You need us. You need masters because you can't control yourselves. And Douglas is so smart because he sees that is a ploy. It's a kind of brainwashing ploy because it probably did work with some people. They probably did wake up disgusted at their own behavior and say, well, maybe they're right. Maybe that's just the way I ought to be. Maybe I was made to be this way because look at how irresponsible I was the other day when they gave me all this freedom and liquor and all this kind of stuff, and I just behaved like a fool. Disregarding the fact that almost everyone without rules behaves like a fool a lot. And especially when they haven't been used to freedom or raised in an environment where they've been taught to exercise freedom responsibly like normal human beings do. If they've been deprived any use of freedom whatsoever, it's a bit like turning people loose with chocolate cake when they've been told all their lives you can't ever taste it. It's not uncommon that you might overindulge a bit with that. Douglas is a smart guy. He sees what the sort of the strategies are behind slavery, and he's way too clever to fall for what the propaganda says. Now, we see this as well, especially with the Covey incident. And I want us to turn to that in particular when he is sent to a slave breaker. And he says, Mr. Covey broke me. No question about it. He says, behold a man transformed into a brute. I mean, this guy worked me, beat me to a point where I just didn't care anymore. And it happens. He's human. That's his point. Not that slaves are better or worse than anybody else. They're just like everyone else. And just like everyone else, we all have our breaking point. And he says, I hate to say it, but the guy broke me. But at a certain point, he also says, after having been broken, he got to a point where he says, you know what, I had nothing to lose. And I don't know how I did it, but at one point I just got tired of being kicked around. And I thought, I'm going to die and I don't really care. But the bottom line is, I'm going to fight back. And he says, at another point, and this is a wonderful rhetorical effect here, you have seen how a man was made a slave, you will see how a slave was made a man. Marvelous piece of rhetorical structure there. He talks about the showdown with Covey, and then finally he decides to just duke it out with him. He says, I probably, at the moment, I thought, yeah, I'm going to die, but I'm going to die and I'm going to hurt this guy. I'm going to take him down. He's going to know he was in a fight. And in fact, he fights back, and he says, Mr. Covey seemed now to think that he had me and could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came this spirit, I don't know. I resolved to fight. And, suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did so, I rose. He held on to me, and I to him. My resistance was so entirely unexpected that Covey seemed to be taken all aback. He trembled like a leaf. This gave me assurance, and I held him uneasy, causing the blood to run where I touched him with the ends of my fingers. Mr. Covey soon called out to Hughes for help. Essentially gives him a huge kick, which really hurt the second in command there, Mr. Hughes. When he saw Hughes bending over in pain, his courage quailed. He asked me if I meant to persist in my resistance. I told him I did, come what may. And essentially, as the battle goes on, both of them get the absolute ever-loving snot kicked out of each other. But in the final analysis, he says, Mr. Covey, he said, the whole 6 months afterwards that I spent with Mr. Covey, he never laid the weight of his finger upon me in anger. He would occasionally say he didn't want to get a hold of me again. No, I thought, you need not, for you'll come off worse than you did before. This battle, he says, with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free. Again, he learned something. This man's a slave breaker. His whole reputation is based on the fact that if you send me a rebellious slave, by golly, I'll whip him into submission. Well, what he found out is, when one of them doesn't, he doesn't want that getting out. It ruins his reputation as being this wonderful superhuman slave breaker. So who wants his reputation as a slave breaker ruined by a guy who beat the living snot out of him? Secondly, he thinks, well, I may boss him around, but I sure don't want to tussle with this guy again, because I may end up killing him, but he's going to get a few licks into me pretty well before that happens, and I don't believe I want the bargain. What essentially Douglas decides is, when you got nothing to lose, you got nothing to lose. So you might as well go down fighting. And then, in the midst of that, he walks away thinking, hey, I actually lived. And not only did I live, this guy pretty much left me alone from this point on, for reasons I had hardly expected that he would. So this gradual liberation, it's a psychological liberation. It's a series of revelations that he gets, that education leads to certain things. When he tricks the little white kids into teaching him how to read by saying, you spell cat C-T-A, and the kid says, no, you spell it C-A-T, you dummy. Oh, really? Okay. Very clever little fellow. He understands that there is a series of rules that are kept from him. He's not to know what those rules are. But once he gets a gaze behind the curtain and sees the mechanism of slavery at operation, the light comes on and he begins to formulate plans. He develops skills as a boat maker. He develops his reading and writing skills. He hones his intellectual abilities, and he even formulates an escape plan that, although it fails, it taught him something additional, that the next time I do it, I'm going to succeed. And then, lo and behold, in 1838, the next time he tried to escape, he did succeed. One of the most interesting things about Douglas's narrative is its brutal honesty and sort of realism before realism was in vogue. The